The chair scraped back so hard it left a mark on the floor. That was the first sound. Not the words that came after. Not the silence that followed those words. Just that chair and the sound it made, and the way every head in that boardroom turned toward the door. She was 26 years old. She had been out of the Canadian Forces for 14 months. She still walked like she owned every room she entered, not out of arrogance, but out of something that had been trained into her so deep it had become bone. Her name was Sade Achebe, and nobody in that room had expected her to say anything at all. Let's go back, because the beginning matters here. Sade grew up in Scarborough, east end of Toronto, the part of the city that people from Rosedale describe with that particular careful neutrality that tells you everything you need to know. Her mother, Constance, had come from Accra in 1994 with a nursing degree and $40 Canadian in her coat pocket. Her father, Raymond, drove transit for 31 years. They owned a semi-detached on Danforth, and they were proud of it. And they had every right to be. Sade was the kind of kid who finished her homework before dinner and then read ahead, not because anyone told her to, because the alternative was sitting still. And sitting still was not something her body understood. She joined cadets at 14, not because of the uniform, because of the structure. Because when she put on that uniform and stood in formation, for the first time in her life she felt like someone had looked at her, at exactly her, not her potential, not her future, not what she might become, and said, "You are enough for this moment." She was commissioned at 22. 2 tours, one in Latvia, one in Mali. She came back quieter than she left. The kind of quiet that isn't peace. When she separated from the forces, she enrolled at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Not because she had always dreamed of business. Because she had spent 4 years executing other people's strategies. And she had spent a lot of cold nights thinking about what she would have done differently if anyone had asked her. Nobody had asked her. She was going to make herself someone they had to ask. The program was 2 years. She was 18 months in when the thing happened. The thing that this story is actually about. There is a professor at Rotman, and he has been there long enough that the school has named a seminar room after him, which tells you something, whose name is Leonard Voss. He has written 4 books. He has been cited in the Harvard Business Review 6 times. He has a way of standing at the front of a classroom that communicates, without him ever having to say it directly, that your presence in his course is a privilege he is extending to you personally, and one he could revoke. The course was Strategic Crisis Management. It was a second-year elective, and it was oversubscribed every semester because Voss had a reputation for producing a particular kind of graduate. The kind that got hired fast, promoted fast, and quoted in business journalism before they turned 35. Sade had waited a year and a half to get into it. She sat in the 3rd row. Not the front. The front was for people who needed to be seen. The 3rd row was where you could hear everything and be underestimated by everyone. The first 3 weeks were unremarkable. Voss lectured, students took notes. The case studies were the kind you had already read in 3 other courses, but presented with enough new framing that you could pretend otherwise. Then came the 4th week. He put the case on the screen at 8:07 in the morning. Crisis scenario. A mid-sized Canadian resource company, fictitious, operating a pipeline through disputed First Nations territory in northern British Columbia. An explosion. 3 workers dead. An immediate media cycle. Indigenous protesters blocking access roads. A CEO who had made public statements that were now being played on loop by every national outlet. "You have 72 hours, Voss said. You are the crisis management team. What do you do?" He said it the way a person drops something off a cliff. Not a question, a test. And something in his voice communicated that the test was already mostly graded. Groups formed the way they always do in MBA programs, quickly, efficiently, along lines of previous collaboration and social familiarity. Sade ended up in a group of 4. There was a guy named Patrick who had done his undergrad at Queen's and talked very fast. There was a woman named Deborah who worked in PR before going back to school and had strong opinions. There was a man named Taras who had been a city councilor in Winnipeg and brought that particular quality of measured, public-facing calm that politicians develop as a survival mechanism. And there was Sade. They worked for 40 minutes. They came up with something coherent. Deborah drafted the communications framework. Patrick built the timeline. Taras handled the stakeholder mapping. Sade sat back and listened to all of it, and she did not say much, because she was noticing something that nobody else in the room seemed to be noticing yet. Then Voss called time. Groups presented one by one. The presentations were good. MBA students are trained to present well. The packaging is always clean. The language is always confident. The slides exist even when there are no slides. Group after group went up and proposed versions of the same thing. Contain the media narrative, engage the Indigenous Liaison Office, bring in outside legal counsel, issue a measured apology that acknowledged harm without admitting liability. Voss listened. He nodded occasionally. He asked sharpening questions. When Sade's group got up, Deborah presented. She did it well. She always did. And then Voss said, "Standard response. Nothing here I haven't seen in every crisis comms textbook published since 2008. He paused. Does anyone in this group want to defend that? Patrick started to say something about the communications timeline being particularly tight given the media cycle. Voss didn't look at Patrick. He looked at Sade. You, he said, you've been quiet. Do you have something to add, or were you just along for the ride? The room did what rooms do, that small collective shift. A few people looked away. A few people looked more carefully. Sade put her pen down on the desk. There's a problem with the case, she said. You need to understand what that sentence meant in that room at that moment with that professor. Voss had been building this case study for 11 years. It was based on composite real events. It had been used in executive education programs at 3 universities. He had published a condensed version of it in a journal. When students found gaps or inconsistencies in Voss's material, the standard protocol, unwritten and universally understood, was to work around them quietly. Sade said, "There's a problem with the case." "I'm sorry," Voss said. He wasn't sorry. The scenario specifies that the pipeline corridor was approved under a federal environmental assessment completed in 2019, Sade said. But the consultation timeline you included shows the community engagement process ran from March to August of 2018. The assessment came after. That means the community consultations were not conducted in response to the actual approved route. They were conducted in response to a preliminary route that was subsequently modified. That's not a crisis management problem. That's a procedural failure that predates the explosion by 3 years. You can't manage this crisis with a 72-hour response plan because the crisis began during the approvals process. Nobody moved. Patrick was looking at his notebook. Taras had that politician's face, the one that gives away nothing at all. Deborah had gone very still, in the way people go still when they realize something important is happening, and they aren't sure yet which way it's going to fall. Voss looked at Sade for a long moment. The dates in the case are illustrative, he said. They're not meant to be taken as a precise legal timeline. Then the case should say that, Sade said. Because if I were actually managing this crisis, and my team had built a response around those dates, we would be materially wrong about our legal exposure. The consultation gap creates a duty to consult violation. That changes the entire response framework. You're not just managing media. You're managing pending litigation and potential injunctions. Those require different resources, different legal strategy, and a different internal communications approach. Voss set down his marker. He looked at her in the way that people look at something they did not anticipate encountering. Where are you getting the duty to consult timeline from? He said. Haida Nation, Sade said. And Taku River. and the UNDRIP Implementation Act, and the 2023 BCCA decision on the Coastal GasLink corridor, which your case study is clearly modeled on, at least partially. The consultation timelines in that case were a central issue in the injunction proceedings. The room was the kind of quiet that has weight. Voss did not say she was right. He said, "Interesting angle," and he moved on. That is what this kind of person does. They don't concede. They redirect. They take the challenge, and they reclassify it as a contribution they were already aware of, and they move the conversation somewhere else before anyone has time to register what just happened. Sade recognized the maneuver. She had seen variations of it in briefing rooms, in mess halls, in debriefing sessions where someone with more rank than accuracy needed to not be visibly wrong. She let it go. For 2 weeks, what happened in those 2 weeks mattered. Voss redesigned the assignment parameters. He sent a note to the class explaining that the case study had been updated to reflect current regulatory context. He did not say why. He changed the consultation dates. He added a footnote about the UNDRIP Implementation Act. He built the duty to consult issue into the new version as one of several advanced considerations that students with a background in environmental or indigenous law might want to explore. He built in the correction. He just didn't name where it came from. 3 people noticed. Taurus noticed because Taurus paid attention to everything. Deborah noticed because she was in PR and she understood the difference between change and credited change. And a student named Heather, who was in her 3rd year of law school concurrently and had done her undergraduate thesis on UNDRIP implementation, noticed and sent Sade a message that said simply, "He fixed the case study. I saw what you said in class. Good catch." That was all. No announcement. No acknowledgement. The class moved on, and Voss moved on, and the corrected case study went into the course materials without attribution, the way things go into rivers. Sade said nothing. She told herself she was being pragmatic. She told herself that in the grand scheme of her career, this was a minor thing. She told herself that the correction had happened, that the material was accurate now, and that outcomes mattered more than credit. She was right about all of it. She did not feel right. There is a thing that happens to people who have been trained for high-stakes environments. They develop a very accurate internal sensor for the difference between a problem that has been solved and a problem that has been managed. Solved means the root issue is gone. Managed means the surface has been smoothed over and the root is still there, still growing, still connected to things you haven't looked at yet. The case study was managed. The course continued. And then, 6 weeks later, Voss held what he called an open evaluation session. This was a semi-annual event where he invited second-year students to present independent analyses of real-world crisis scenarios, publicly, in front of the class, and occasionally invited guests from industry. There were industry guests this time. Sade found out the morning of, from Heather, who had heard from someone in the program office. 3 guests, 2 from a major pipeline company, 1 from a federal regulatory body, whose name Sade recognized from briefings she had read while still in uniform. She sat in the same chair. 3rd row. The presentations began. They were good. They were always good. These were people who had worked hard to be in this room. And then Voss said, and this was the moment, the one this whole story has been moving toward. Voss said, "I want to open the floor. We have guests today who deal with these issues at an operational level. If anyone has a question or observation that goes beyond the presentations, now is the time." He was looking at the industry guests when he said it. He was not looking at Sade, but Sade was already standing. You have to understand that she didn't plan this. Or maybe she did, in the way that soldiers plan things, not in advance, not with a written strategy, but by having thought through enough contingencies that when the moment arrives, the response feels automatic. She had spent 6 weeks watching the correction be absorbed into the course without acknowledgement. She had spent 6 weeks thinking about the 3 workers in the scenario who were dead, and the community whose land the pipeline crossed, and the way the case study framing had originally directed students to think about the explosion as the crisis, rather than the process that made the explosion inevitable. She stood up. "My name is Sade Achebe," she said. "I have a question for our guests, if that's appropriate." Voss looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. "Go ahead," he said. She turned to face the guests directly. "In a scenario where federal environmental assessment approval precedes the conclusion of meaningful duty to consult obligations," she said, "what is the operational threshold at which a company decides the legal risk of proceeding is outweighed by the reputational and regulatory risk of pausing? And how does that threshold change when the relevant First Nation has explicitly communicated an objection in writing prior to the assessment conclusion?" The room went quiet in a different way than before. Not the weight of embarrassment, the weight of a question that everyone in the room recognized as real. The man from the regulatory body, he was older. He had the look of someone who had answered 1,000 questions in public forums, shifted slightly in his seat. "That's a very specific question," he said. "It's a question that arises directly from the case study methodology being used in this course," Sade said. "I'm asking because the current framing treats the crisis as a communications problem. I think the evidence suggests it's an approvals process problem. And I'm curious whether the people who operate in this space think that distinction matters operationally." There was a pause. "Yes," said the woman from the pipeline company, quietly, like she was agreeing with something she had been thinking about for a while. "It matters." Voss intervened after that. He thanked the guests. He redirected the conversation. He managed the room back to its expected shape. He was very good at it. After class, 2 students came to find Sadie in the hallway. One of them she barely knew. A guy named Brendan from her international strategy course who had never said more than a polished sentence or two in any context she had encountered him. He said, "That was the right question." Just that. The other was Heather, who said, "The woman from the pipeline company." She stayed after. "She asked the program coordinator for your name." Sade took that in. "Did she get it?" "I don't know," Heather said. 3 days later, Sade got an email from an address she did not recognize. The name on the email was Francine Asante Park. The company name was one she had heard of, one that had in the previous 2 years navigated a significant regulatory dispute involving a northern resource project, and had come out of it having made public commitments to a revised consultation framework. The email said, in part, "I was at the Rotman session on Thursday. I'd like to have a conversation, if you're open to it. Not about a job, just a conversation. I think you're asking the right questions, and I'm interested in who asks right questions." Sade read it twice. Then she read it a third time, because she had been trained to distrust things that arrive too easily, and she wanted to make sure she understood what it actually said and what it didn't say. It didn't say anything it shouldn't have. She wrote back. They met at a coffee shop on Bay Street. Francine Asante Park was in her early 50s, Ghanaian Canadian, with the kind of measured presence that comes from having spent decades being the only woman in rooms where the default assumption was that she didn't belong. She had started in engineering, moved into regulatory affairs, and had eventually become the head of Indigenous Relations and Environmental Compliance for her company. They talked for 2 hours. Francine said, "When I was your age, I found a significant error in a project feasibility report. The error changed the cost-benefit calculation by a meaningful margin. I flagged it to my supervisor. He thanked me privately, corrected the report, and submitted it without attribution. I received no credit. I watched him receive credit for a report that would have been wrong without my catch." She set her cup down. "I'm telling you that story," she said, "because I want you to know that what happened to you in that classroom is not unusual, and I want you to think about what you want to do with the fact that it is not unusual." Sade was quiet for a moment. "What did you do?" she said, After your supervisor submitted the report. Francine smiled. It was the smile of someone who has earned the right to it. I built a career on being the person who doesn't let it happen twice, she said. Not loudly, not with a lot of declarations. Just by making myself so correct, so consistently, that ignoring my contributions became operationally expensive. The coffee shop was on Bay Street, and it was November in Toronto, which means the light outside the window was the particular flat gray of a city that has accepted winter as a permanent condition. Sade watched a woman in a yellow coat walk past on the sidewalk. She thought about Scarborough. She thought about her father, who had driven the same route for 31 years and who had never once complained about it in her hearing, though she had understood as she got older that not complaining and not having feelings were not the same thing. She thought about the correction that had gone into the course materials without her name. She thought about the 3 imaginary workers who were dead in a scenario that had been framed wrong. She thought about the woman from the pipeline company who had said quietly, "Yes, it matters." "I don't want to make it expensive," Sade said finally. Francine looked at her. "I want to make it impossible," Sade said. "To ignore. I want to be the person who has already put the right answer on paper with a date on it before anyone else has had time to notice the question." Francine was quiet for a long moment. "That," she said, "is a different ambition. Is it a worse one?" "No," Francine said. "It's a harder one. Here is what happened next." Sade finished her degree. She graduated with distinction. She won the school's prize for outstanding contribution to case study methodology, an award that had never previously been given to a second-year student. The citation described her work in terms that were careful and accurate, and did not mention the specific incident that had led to her independent research into consultation process frameworks, because by that point the citation was written by Voss, and Voss was the kind of man who was capable of genuine admiration for a person, and simultaneously incapable of publicly crediting them. She did not accept the position that Francine's company offered her. She accepted a position with a national indigenous-led resource consultancy that was building a new practice area in crisis prevention rather than crisis management. The distinction mattered. It was the distinction she had named in that classroom. Solve the problem before the explosion, not after. She was 27 years old. She had been out of the Canadian Forces for 2 years and 3 months. She still walked into rooms like she owned them. Not out of arrogance. Out of something that had been trained into her so deep it had become bone, and that she had since learned to use as a tool rather than a reflex. The case study that Leonard Voss uses today, the one in the current version of strategic crisis management. The one that second-year MBA students at Rotman work through in their 4th week of the course, includes a detailed appendix on duty to consult timelines and their implications for crisis response frameworks. The appendix has a footnote. The footnote cites 3 sources: Haida Nation, Taku River, and the 2023 BCCA decision on the Coastal GasLink corridor. It does not cite Sade Achebe. There is a chair in that classroom, 3rd row, that still has a faint mark on the floor beside it from where it was scraped back too hard on a morning in November. That mark is not in the footnotes either, but it is still there, and Sade knows it is still there, and she has decided that is enough.